that we can start off this morning with the Minister for Defence Personnel, Welfare and Veterans, Marck Francois. The Minister has been Minister since September 2012. He's the MP for Raleigh and Wickford. He's done that since 2001. You'll see from his biographical details that his background absolutely equips him to talk about this complex relationship between military force and society, particularly in relation to the reserves. And I'm very glad to say that as a reservist, he's a Royal Anglian. And so everything in his background, I think, makes him the right person to talk about the nature of this relationship, and in particular, the issue of the reserves. I know, Minister, you're extremely busy. It's a really busy week for you for reasons that you will reveal. But I'm delighted that you're able to start the process of the week off for you at our conference. Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. CDS, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to be here this morning to speak at your important conference. As the Chairman has said, I've now been in this job for around about 10 months. And having served myself, albeit some years ago, I'm very aware that service personnel and veterans have a way of keeping you grounded if they think that in any way your responsibilities are going to your head. And I was given a stark reminder of this a couple of months ago when I visited a veterans housing project in Bristol. It's a really good idea. A bunch of Army veterans have got together and built their own block of flats in Bedminster. They were provided with the land and the materials by a charity, but they've actually constructed the building themselves and to a high standard. And I heard about this and asked to go and see it. And I met a chap who served in Northern Ireland. We went into his flat. We had a cup of coffee over his kitchen table. And the chairman of the charity was there, the chairman of the local council, some people from my private office, the great and the good. And we've been nattering for about half an hour on the background to this project and how it came to pass. And then he leant across the table and he said to me, "So let me get this right. You're a minister, right?" And I said, "Yes, that's right, I'm a minister." "Okay. So are you like Methodist or Catholic or what?" And it turned out on subsequent investigation he'd been acting in good faith but had got the wrong end of the stick. He was under the impression that I was the padre from the Regimental Association who'd come on a welfare visit. So these things keep you grounded. Our armed forces are at the very heart of our society. They provide the security that allows all other aspects of society to function. Society can sometimes be a vague concept, but our armed forces have been central to defining our understanding of it. Throughout our history, they've answered the call to defend our mutual interests and protect our shared values, the linchpins, I would argue, of any society. It's down to them that when we think about the British identity, one of the first things that comes to mind is our proud martial heritage. Protecting the rule of law, helping the vulnerable, defending freedom wherever it is threatened, both at home and abroad. Earlier this month, we paid tribute to those veterans who stormed the Normandy beaches to help free Europe from Nazi tyranny. I was privileged to lay several wreaths on behalf of the government as part of the commemoration of that day. This was personally poignant for me as my father, Reginald Francois, served aboard a minesweeper on D-Day 69 years ago. But the vital contribution of our armed forces is as relevant today as it ever has been. Because the armed forces are an integral part of the society that they defend. Those who have served are all around us in the population. Around 1 in 10 of the adult population of the United Kingdom is a veteran, working from the Second World War back through Korea, National Service, Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Telek and Herrick. It's around 1 in 10. We're even present in Parliament. There are clearly a number of senior officers in the House of Lords, or as we refer to it at work, the other place. But in the House of Commons, it's perhaps an underappreciated fact that over 50 currently serving members of Parliament have worn the Queen's uniform, either as regulars or as reservists, and I'm proud to be one of them. The members of our armed forces, past and present, regular and reserve, have made an incredible contribution to this country. Some, as we are well aware, have made the ultimate sacrifice on our behalf. We owe our armed forces an enormous debt. The sheer breadth and pace of recent operations has raised awareness of the bravery and dedication of our service personnel, and public support for our armed forces is arguably now at an all-time high. Some excellent work has been done by all sections of society, by the public sector, the private sector, and by charities to help harness this support. The public broadly understands that our armed forces have been at war in Iraq and Afghanistan for over a decade. But this is evolving. Afghan security forces now assuming control of their own security represents a real milestone in our progress towards ending combat operations in Afghanistan. We are starting to bring our people back home, and they are rightly being welcomed as heroes when they return. However, this presents us with a challenge as well. As we shift from a period of operations to a posture of contingency, we must work hard to maintain public support for the armed forces beyond the end of our campaign in Afghanistan in 2014. We cannot, and indeed we must not, take the public support for granted during this transition. Therefore, I believe we have to seize the opportunity to put in place now policy and procedures which will support our armed forces and their families and our veterans well beyond the end of 2014, and indeed policies and procedures which will endure for many years thereafter. This is an opportunity to ensure the legacy of our armed forces' recent effort is properly remembered and appreciated by the general public and is cemented here at home. That's why the government has made honouring the Armed Forces Covenant an important objective, and why we enshrined its two key principles in law: that the armed forces community should not face disadvantage with regard to the provision of public and commercial services, and that special consideration is appropriate in some cases, particularly for those who give it the most, such as the injured and the bereaved. The Secretary of State for Defence is now obliged by statute under the Armed Forces Act 2011 to report annually to Parliament, and thus to the country, on the implementation of the Covenant. The Prime Minister has established a Cabinet subcommittee chaired by Oliver Lepwin, specifically to monitor progress on the implementation of the Covenant and to chase up where necessary. And the Prime Minister has been known to drop in on that committee from time to time, which, as you will appreciate, helps wonderfully to concentrate minds. In addition, the Government's commitment was demonstrated by the Chancellor's decision to allocate £35 million from the fines levied on banks for attempting to manipulate the LIBOR interest rate to supporting the Armed Forces Covenant, mainly through grants to service charities. This has been reinforced by the Chancellor's commitment in this week's spending review to continue to support the Armed Forces Covenant from LIBOR fines cash, and we're clearly very, very grateful for that. This first tranche of funding of LIBOR money included, amongst other things, £1 million for Fisher House, which provides accommodation for the families of wounded personnel being treated at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham. Fisher House was opened by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales only last Friday, and I was privileged to attend and to have the opportunity to meet some of our wounded and our families there as well. But the Covenant is a contract between the armed forces and the whole of society, and we must understand that society is much larger than just central government. We can't do it all from the centre, nor should we. So I'm pleased that initiatives like the Armed Forces Community Covenant have gained such momentum. The Community Covenant is designed to deepen the integration of military and civil communities at local level, ensuring that local authorities and other local organisations are well placed to understand and respond to the needs of their armed forces communities. To date, over 330 local authorities have signed up, representing over 3/4 of the local authorities in the United Kingdom, and we are witnessing many examples of the benefits this scheme can bring. Across the country, these partnerships have helped local authorities to understand the needs of service families including practical measures to improve access to GPs, dentists, to provide schooling for children when a unit moves from one garrison to another, providing housing allocations for veterans who have left the service. With regard to the Community Covenant, the Local Government Association and local government as a whole has well and truly stood up, and I would like to pay tribute to them today for the efforts that they have made on behalf of the wider Armed Forces family. To some extent, the missing bit of the jigsaw under the Covenant heading has been business. The private sector has often been very generous in its support of our servicemen and women, but to date they've lacked a vehicle to coordinate this support and to ensure it reaches those who require it most. Many companies have instinctively wanted to do the right thing by our service personnel and their families, but haven't really been sure how best to go about it. So today we're going to help. We're going to launch something called the Corporate Covenant. The Corporate Covenant is a voluntary pledge from corporate entities such as businesses, but also charitable organisations, to develop relationships with the armed forces and provide the support that's most appropriate to their own situation and capacity. In practical terms, it will cover employment support to veterans, support for service families, helping spouses to find jobs, discounts and tailored services for the armed forces community, support for cadet units, and also for initiatives like Armed Forces Day. But the only real limits to the Corporate Covenant are the imaginations of the organisations that are involved. Now let me show you, if I may, in a little more detail, what the Corporate Covenant actually entails. This is what the Army might call a walk-through, talk-through. That's the front page of the Corporate Covenant document. We've kept it simple. It's basically 3 pages. We didn't want to come up with verbiage. We wanted something that was straightforward, that people could easily understand. So this is what a company signing up to the Corporate Covenant will sign. We, the undersigned, commit to honour the Armed Forces Covenant, support the Armed Forces community. We recognise the value serving personnel, both regular and reservist veterans and military families, contribute to our business and our country. And that will then be signed by someone in authority for that company, and if they would like it, a representative of the Ministry of Defence. There is a summary of the Covenant itself, which was produced in 2011. I particularly enjoy the line that reads, "The first duty of government is the defence of the realm." I think it does no harm to remind people of that as often as we can. Then, on the next page, there are 2 sections. The first reiterates the 2 principles of the Covenant and commits the company in its business dealings to uphold them. So, the no disadvantage principle and also the special treatment principle where appropriate. So any company that signs the Corporate Covenant is signing up in effect to honour these 2 principles in its day-to-day business dealings. Section 2, demonstrating our commitment. This is a menu of options that a company can choose to sign up to, depending on its circumstances and what they feel they can bear. And let me perhaps explain, if I may, a little bit more about each of these options. Promoting the fact that we're an armed forces friendly organisation. That almost speaks for itself, but that means the company is making a public pledge that it is pro the armed forces and the wider armed forces family, so we would expect them to use that on their literature, and the logo here, which they can use for 5 years if they sign up to the Covenant. They're at liberty to display in their offices, in their business premises, on their letterhead, on their invoices, and on their vehicle fleet, if they have it. Seeking to support the employment of veterans, young and old. This means that they will guarantee to offer job interviews for veterans when they are advertising posts. It doesn't mean that they guarantee to give that veteran the job. That is their choice as the employer. But it does mean that they give our veterans a chance to go into that interview room and to make the best possible presentation. So Often in getting a job, a lot of the challenge is getting yourself in front of the person that might recruit you. This means they'll guarantee at least to give you a fighting chance to make the case. Striving to support the employment of service spouses and partners. This is a particular challenge for us. If we move a unit from one part of the country to another, a number of the spouses and partners may have jobs in the first location, but then have to scrabble to get new jobs in the second. This, in essence, is the same principle that employers would offer to give an interview to a service spouse or partner. Under employment law, they can't ask, are you a service spouse or partner? Although it's obvious often from the CV, because why do you keep moving around every 2 years? But under this scheme, they would guarantee that if a spouse or partner self-identifies themselves as such, in return they would give them an interview and hopefully perhaps give them a job. Next, endeavouring to offer a degree of flexibility in granting leave for service spouses and partners before, during and after a partner's deployment. We all know instinctively how important it is for service personnel to be able to spend leave with their families, not least if they got a 2-week break during an overseas deployment or when they come back for post-operational tour leave. This means the employer agrees to be mindful of that and to do their best to arrange leave for their members of their family when it's convenient to them. Seeking to support our employees who choose to be members of the reserve forces, including by accommodating their training and deployment where possible. We're going to publish the Reserve's white paper very soon. There's been a great deal of debate about the fact that we need employer support in order to make this process work. We now have it. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Offering support to local cadet units, either in our local community or in local schools where possible. This could be encouraging your employees to be cadet instructors. It could mean sponsoring a local cadet unit, not literally putting your name across the uniform, but offering them money. It could mean getting together a work party of employees one weekend and going down to repaint the local cadet hut. It means that as an organisation you're cadet friendly and you do your best to help the local cadets where you can. Aim to actively participate in Armed Forces Day. You could offer to fly the Armed Forces Day flag on your premises or have people in your company volunteer to help out on the day in your local community. Offering a discount to members of the Armed Forces community. We already have a thing called the Defence Discount Scheme that a number of companies have signed up to. You can get money off on a number of products, on having your car serviced, on certain holidays, in certain clothing retailers. You could even get a discount at KFC. We're not doing hamburgers yet, but we are doing chicken. Or the company could offer a discount of its own outside of the scheme. It's up to them. And then we had any additional commitments line, because there might be things in addition that a company can come up with that we haven't necessarily thought of here. We have no monopoly of wisdom, so they can add in anything else that they think is appropriate. And as it says here, we would encourage them to sign up to as many of the above as appropriate. They then commit to publicise their commitments through the literature or their website, setting out how they will seek to honour the corporate covenant and inviting feedback from the service community and customers on how they're doing. We didn't want a complicated governance process where they send us a report every year on how they're doing and then we have to read the report and mark their homework and write back to them. This will be self-governing in a sense. This whole process is designed to be as bureaucracy-free as possible. The only caveat we have is we have a reserve power to withdraw the logo should we find out that a company is doing something that isn't really compatible with the military ethos. I hope we'll never have to use that power, but it's there just in case we need it. In order to explain to employers exactly what they're signing up to, we produce some very simple guidance notes. They're only 4 pages long, and it explains to an employer best practice under each of those headings. It says a little bit more about some of the examples that I've given you, so that if an employer is minded to sign it, but just wants to double check exactly what the commitment is, it says it in there. And you may have noticed we've used conditional language throughout. We will aim to, we will seek, we will strive, we will endeavour. This is not legally binding. No one should be sued over this. The point is that you're offering to do the right thing as a company. And if you've got the right spirit, this helps you do the right thing. So we've tried to avoid making it massively legalistic for obvious reasons. We've got some copies of this that we can hand out and some of the guidance notes. If anybody wants more detail, there is the web link, and people can get more detail via that. I mentioned reservists. The armed forces community comprises many different components, each interacting with the private sector in different ways. The business sector is particularly vital to our plans for changes to the reserves. It's important we get the relationship right between the reservists, their employer, and the armed forces they serve. We'll be setting out the details of reserves of the future in a white paper which will be published very shortly. But the corporate covenant will provide employers the opportunity to develop their support for any employees who are reservists, and I hope they will be keen to do so. Because reservists have always played an essential role in our armed forces, including even in the 1980s when I was young, and their dedication, professionalism and contribution have been vital to achieving their success. Since 2003, there have been over 25,000 reservist mobilisations, serving alongside their regular counterparts, and 30 have paid the ultimate price for their country. Reservists make a vital contribution to this country as integrated members of the armed forces and integrated members of civil society. They are, to famously quote Churchill, twice a citizen. The corporate covenant will help strengthen the bond between employer and reservists and will be referenced accordingly in the white paper. We need employer support to make this process work. We believe that we now have it. So I'm delighted to tell you we've made a good start with the corporate covenant. The British Chambers of Commerce, the Business Services Association, the Confederation of British Industry, the Federation of Small Businesses, and the Institute of Directors have endorsed this initiative. And to use CGS's famous phrase, they stand ready to sign the corporate covenant on behalf of the business community in this country. We will do so today at noon at Horse Guards. But this is only the beginning. In launching the corporate covenant today, we're also launching a recruiting drive up and down the country to encourage companies from small businesses to large corporations to sign up and to do their bit to support the whole armed forces family. So, ladies and gentlemen, consider this something of a call to arms. I'd urge you to encourage all those you know in business, all your friends and your contacts, to get involved in this scheme, because it's vital that we do our bit to support the men and women who work so hard to keep us safe. Now is a seminal time of change for the armed forces. So many of them will be coming home from Afghanistan and from Germany as well. They're undergoing structural change as they move towards Future Force 2020. This is an opportunity to ensure we give something back to those who've given so much for us. So, ladies and gentlemen, we now have an additional opportunity to honour the covenant in a new and exciting way. I hope we've come up with something here that will really help our people for many years to come. So I would humbly beseech you to persuade all those you know in business to come and join us and to seize this with both hands. Thank you very much.
Never let it be said, you don't get full value at Brucey conferences. So not only but the launch of a new policy, which will be officially inaugurated at noon today. So you heard it here first. And it's an important step forward. It's specific. As you say, Minister, any really important document is relatively short. And what it represents to businesses is not only an exercise in good citizenship, but an exercise in good business practice. And I think you've done that, or at least in the outline of this, it suggests that very strongly. And I also have to say, as a professional politician, you know that after noon today you've got to go out and argue for it and defend it politically. But the hard bit is getting it to this point. Getting it to the point where it's able to be launched. That's the hard bit. For a professional politician, defending it's easy. It's making it to this point, which is important. And congratulations on that. So, I'm going to cut into the next session a little bit for some Q&A on this issue, because I'm chairing the next session, so I don't care. Let's give ourselves 10 minutes or so for Q&A. And I imagine you're I can check this with you before, I imagine you want to stay on the record for this party.
Yes, I'm very happy to do that.
Yeah, okay. So, who would like to begin?
Reassuring to hear that there are 50 former serving officers of one description or another in the House of Commons. I think that there are 3 defence ministers, in fact, are there not, who have served.
There are
4. 4? That's even better. There are, I think it's probably true to say that most of those 50 are on the Tory benches, which you would naturally be proud of. And I was just wondering whether you couldn't come together and come up with a cunning plan to get one of them into the cabinet where policy is agreed, and even better, one of them into the Treasury where policy is made. Just a thought.
Bless you for the. As I'm one of the 50, if you wanted to drop a note to the Prime Minister, I think Ian Duncan Smith, who serves in the cabinet, is proud to have been a Guardsman. But we, of that 50, it's slightly over 50. And what I'd like to do one day is to kind of line them all up, if you see what I mean. You know, we'll leave the old uniforms at home, but now the suits, regimental ties. I think that would be quite a powerful photograph, because I think most members of the armed forces have no idea there are that many MPs who actually serve. The breakdown's interesting. A little over 40 in the Army, fractionally more ex-regulars than reservists, but only slight, and then you've got about 5 ex-Royal Navy and about 5 ex-Royal Air Force. I mean, that's a very rough breakdown, but that's how it works out. But I think we all probably need to try and publicise a bit more, because I think many service personnel think there's only 3 or 4 high-profile MPs that they associate with the armed forces, and actually it's far wider than that. That's also a discipline on me if I'm doing a debate in the House of Commons. There are many people sitting in there who understand the subject. Churchill famously said in the House of Commons, it's an interesting place. Your opponents sit opposite you, but your enemies sit behind you.
The public often talk about lining up MPs, but not only for a next question.
Yeah.
Can't see up in the gallery there. You're one of those.
Minister, just the... Sorry, my name is Captain Fellows. I work at HQ Theatre Troops. The corporate covenant is extremely encouraging, and I can see a lot of elements of it which would be welcome within the wider public sector, such as guaranteeing job interviews for veterans and spouses of veterans. What action is being taken to spread those positive aspects of the covenant to other government departments and other aspects of the public sector?
Well, this will be for the public sector and the private sector. So in terms of reserves, government has to give a lead. If we're going to ask employers to do the right thing by reservists, we need to show some moral leadership in government. So for instance, government departments now provide an additional 2 weeks paid leave for a reservist for when they're on top of their other commitments in the year. So we are providing that extra fortnight paid, and we're going to ask other employees where they can to see if they can match it. And there's now a reserve champion in each major government department. We had a meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I was very much encouraging them to spread the message throughout their own departments. So the public sector, I believe, is now starting to give a lead, but this is designed also for the private sector, and it's also designed so that the BTs and BPs of this world could see it, but so could Bill Blogg's engineering under the arches in the East End. You're not constrained by size. The principles effectively are the same. Yeah? So it's designed to be public sector and private sector and charities. We already have over 1,000 service charities, but other non-service charities as corporate entities, if they wish, could sign this too. That's how it's been constructed. Yeah?
Okay. Thank you. Question down there, sir.
Ray Wilton, I'm AD Reserves in the Army Headquarters. Just one question, Mr. to with the use of the corporate covenant. I understand in the States that where firms are bidding for public contracts, if they can demonstrate that they have a supportive attitude towards the forces, that is one of the criteria that are used to judge whether or not their bid is successful. I'm aware also that with public bids anyway, you ask standard questions like, does the organisation have a quality management system, or does it adhere to business excellence, and those sorts of issues. Are there any plans to include a question about corporate governance?
I've got to be careful. I don't want to tread on the toes of my procurement minister colleague, Mr. Philip Dunn. But my understanding is that we couldn't make that stipulation under contract law. It would be quite difficult to do that. So we can't make it a formality. Nevertheless, if a company wishing to supply the Ministry of Defence had decided to sign up for this scheme, I wouldn't regard that as a drawback.
Understood. One more? Yes? One more?
Peter Quentin from the Institute. Minister, if I may, clearly popularity can come with its own pitfalls.
If I own the company, I'll let you know about that.
We look at the armed forces and its very close relationship with society. I'm sure we'll come on to this in the next session. I'm just looking at it from your perspective. The Help for Heroes effect, what we've heard elsewhere as well, that's a very, I almost say, an unhelpful sentimentality. Are there constraints to the employment and deployment of our armed forces based on that popularity? Does it increase the political risk aversion?
I understand the question. No, I don't think it does. In government, sometimes you have to take difficult decisions and you have to justify them, including in the House of Commons, which can be a fairly lively place from time to time. But I think one of the challenges that I got sitting in this seat is we've got this marvellous bow wave of public support for the armed forces, the like of which I can never remember in my lifetime. I think the only equivalent to it might have been right in the middle of the Falklands War. But there is a risk that when Afghanistan is not on television week after week, public opinion could move on. The X Factor might become more interesting relatively than it is now. So I believe we have a window of opportunity which we must use in order to put in place policies and procedures that would endure. It's wonderful to have this public support for our people, but we'd be foolish to take that completely for granted. So let's use this bow wave of support, this political space that we've got, to absolutely do the right thing by our people and come up with things like this, which I hope is initially for 5 years, but I hope companies will renew it and it will last for many years to come. Here's our chance to do the right thing by our people, and I'm determined that we should seize it.
Minister, thank you. In all these matters of society's attitude to things, there's only so much a government can do, and it's by and large bad policy to legislate for these things. But I have to say that in this process, it seems very well thought through in terms of thinking about the different avenues that it could take and the different nudges, to use a common phrase now. You haven't nudged society towards wanting to do the things the government thinks it should do. And I have to say that this is pretty impressive. And it's specific, it takes us forward, and it's exactly what we should be speaking about. We're going to move on to the next section now on the British Army and Society. Mr. I understand you're able to stay.
Yes, yeah. But no, I've got to nip off a bit after 11. So.
Understood, yes.
Minister, can I just thank you for taking time here to be the keynote speaker this morning. And we're actually very proud that you're using this forum to lay out the corporate covenant, which many of you here will not have heard much about. But can I thank you also for the energy with which you, as the Minister for our people, and the Army is nothing if it's not a people business. You get around the block, you see everybody, young, old, regular, reservist, veteran serving, and spend a lot of time on the road doing that, and fight the corner on our behalf. Thank you very much indeed.
Bless you.